the majority of what improved were actually my quads. Those grew quite a lot on my first cycle. Obviously, my upper body grew as well, but I was very happy with the amount of size that I was able to gain on my lower body. And I did feel finally like I looked like something. Could I have looked better? Absolutely. Vigorous Steve here. Welcome to the new studio. To celebrate 30,000 subscribers, I decided to go a little bit more professional and get rid of that ugly green couch. I was getting tired of it, and I'm sure some of you guys are getting tired of that ugly green couch as well. So I spent a couple days to build this studio from the ground up, and well, now I'm covered in blisters and scratches, but that's what happens when you do it yourself, right? I still need to soundproof this room, so there might be a little bit of an echo. And you know, there's some construction going on around my house, and there's people living behind their house who apparently brought an entire farm with them while they were constructing this new building that is being built across from our house. That might take another couple months. Hopefully in November, December, they're done with that. But I definitely need to soundproof this room so you guys are not annoyed with the chickens, the dogs, and hammering pylons in left and right. Might still take a couple more days. Hopefully the soundproofing will remove some of the echo that you're hearing right now. Hopefully it's not too bad. Again, this is the first video that I'm recording in this new studio. But going ahead, this will be the new backdrop. This will be the new lighting. The audio quality will hopefully improve over the next couple of days as I finish soundproofing this room. And then we're ready to go to make daily content yet again. Now, before we get into the meat and potatoes of this video, I just want to tell you guys a little bit of a story behind my choice for this backdrop. In 2011, while I was traveling after my first cycle, which is what this video is going to be about. After I finished my first cycle, I traveled through Asia for 50 weeks in total. Actually, I wanted to go for 2 years, but after 50 weeks, my body was pretty tired, and I was starting to miss this bodybuilding thing again. Now, somewhere along the way, I visited the Beijing Olympics area, the Beijing Olympics that were constructed for the Olympics of 2008. And I was inspired by the National Aquatics Center, which has a similar structure and setup as what you see behind me. Unfortunately, I was not able to find panels for the backdrop that represent bubbles or water in general, but I was able to duplicate the comparable lighting setup. So this is as close as I was able to make it. I'm not going to bore you guys with the fluorescent changing RGB lights throughout the recordings, which is what the National Aquatic Center does portray. Every few minutes or something, they have a little bit of a light show going on. I'll overlay some videos so you guys can see what it looks like, because I did bring a video camera with me when I was traveling. So I have hours and hours and hours of footage of the water cube, the National Aquatic Center in Beijing, and many other cool stuff that I saw along my journey, which maybe at one point I'll open up a little bit more about that, because it's like the polar opposite, right, of bodybuilding. And with bodybuilding, you're always in the same space. You're either in the gym, in the kitchen, at the grocery store, or sleeping, or online doing your research. And when you're traveling, you're visiting a new cool place basically every day. I went to the Beijing Olympic sites twice, by the way, because I found it to be very, very impressive. So that's my decision for making this backdrop. The lighting is going to be the same. It's not going to be dynamic, so you don't get annoyed and distracted. And well, let's be honest, most of you guys are not watching this the whole way through. I'm sure a lot of you are listening this at a podcast format, just listening and no watching. Okay, starting to ramble. Let's go back to the meat and potatoes of this video. And that's what I did for my first cycle. I did my first cycle in 2010 after 11 years of drug-free bodybuilding. And when I say bodybuilding, it's probably not entirely bodybuilding. It's being very, very serious about your gym, structuring the workouts, following progressive overload, having specific A and B routines, doing a 5-day split, focusing on my nutrition. But I was still trying to make a career as a consultant. And I did not live as a full-time bodybuilder at that time. So I'll show you what I looked like at that time. Pretty much the best combination, the best pictures I have of the best combination of size and body fat percentage. And for me, I always hold a little bit more body fat in the front, which is also less developed than the back, as you can see clearly from these pictures. I was always also ghostly white most of the time because, again, I was working a lot, no time to go tanning. And the little free time that I had, I usually spent on researching more about bodybuilding. I didn't want to go tanning, which I did do for my first cycle because I wanted to get some good pictures out of it. Because the whole reason why I wanted to do a first cycle, because it might have been my only cycle at that time. After the consultancy firm went belly up, because of the economic crisis of 2008, 2009, there were no projects anymore. There was not much work. And then the consultancy firm went bankrupt. And unfortunately, that bankruptcy case turned into a court case because pensions were not being paid unknowns to us and salaries were not being paid at the end. So that took about 4 or 5 months to resolve. And I already knew that I wanted to travel for a year to 2 years, depending on how much of my salary and pension I would be able to get back by resolving these court cases. So my initial plan was to travel for 2 years, but after 50 weeks, I was kind of tired of looking skinny fat again. So I went back home. But it took about 4 to 5 months to resolve. And during this time was basically the first time since university, high school, that I was able to live as a full-time bodybuilder. So I decided, you know what? If I want to do a cycle, now is the perfect time to do so because I'm not really sure if I'm going to go back to bodybuilding after 2 years of traveling. Which, to be honest, after 6 months of traveling, I did start to miss this bodybuilding thing quite a bit. But I was able to push through to 50 weeks, and then my body was so broken that I needed to go home. So during this period between these bankruptcy case and traveling, I decided to do my first cycle. I recently found my entire cycle log on an old hard disk that I have all my backups on. So I'm able to take you through all of the details that I kept back then. So I kept a little bit of a diary, when I did my first injection, what my initial plan was going to be, and how I made adjustments along the way. So I'll list my entire protocol and then give you guys a little bit of an insight about what I would change with the information that I have now. Because, my first cycle was 11 years ago, and I thought I knew a lot about performance-enhancing drugs and bodybuilding in general, about nutrition and supplementation and trading and all that stuff. But, well, that was 11 years into my natural or drug-free bodybuilding journey. And now it's been 22 years into my bodybuilding journey. And I learned a lot more since I started taking performance-enhancing drugs because that adds so much to the learning curve and it changes so many variables, the training and the nutrition and the supplementation. It gets infinitely more complicated once you start dabbling with performance-enhancing drugs. And trust me, I was researching for years. I was already researching for years before I decided to take the plunge and proceed to supraphysiological testosterone levels. Now, at that time, I mostly did my research on steroid.com, bodybuilding.com, intensemuscle.com, and musclemayhem.com. I believe that site is no longer around, but Intense Muscle is still around. I never registered. at any of these sites. Well, I did register at bodybuilding.com just so I could block, what is his name, Lane Norton, because he was always a misc and every post, he was just being annoying. So that's the only place I registered, bodybuilding.com, just so I could block Lane Norton so I didn't have to read all of this barking and nonsense that he was spewing on the message boards. But the other websites I never registered. I just read for years. And then I decided on the following protocol, which underwent some changes along the way as I got a little bit more experience with my body and more experience with performance-enhancing drugs in general. Again, because the only PED that I ever dabbled with was Stackers 2, which had Muahong extract. So basically ephedrine, right, or ephedra, or whatever it contained. So that was the only PED that I ever had experience with. And then we'll forgo all the recreational drugs that I did in my younger years. I was off the recreational drugs for 5-6 years. I didn't really do that when I was working as a consultant, but in my university days, I dabbled here and there. So when I was 26, I did my first cycle after doing research since I was maybe at the age of 21, 22, so 4 or 5 years of research. I decided on 250 milligrams testosterone enanthate per week because I was scared to do 500 milligrams of test per week. I remember at steroid.com, Intense Muscle, basically every site, first cycle, cookie cutter cycle, 500 milligrams of test, and a debulk kickstart. So luckily I was smart enough to understand that you shouldn't do a debulk kickstart because a lot of side effects, like a lot of people would keep their cycle logs and you would see, a start, first injection, 500 test, starting 40 milligrams Dianabol or 30 milligrams Dianabol. And then like 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks into the cycle log, you see that they get terrible lower back pain and they have a moon face and water retention and they suspect a gynecomastia formation. So I decided, it's too much side effects for me. I'm just going to half the dose, do something that would bring you about, let's say, 200% out of the reference range. At least people were still talking a little bit about blood work, not as much as they do, nowadays. So I'm really trying to actively change that people are doing their blood work more often because nobody around me did blood work. I did blood work every year. Unfortunately, I can't find the blood work, the baseline blood work that I took before I did my first cycle because those results are in Holland. And I asked my mom a couple times to look for it in the boxes that I still have stacked somewhere in my old room. But yeah, she can't find it. So if I ever find myself in Holland again, I will post those blood work results for you guys to see. The printout that I have laying around somewhere because I did keep them, but they're not with me at this time. I just remember that everything was in range. My testosterone was about 650 nanograms per deciliter. And I can't even remember if I checked my estrogen at that time. I think everything was in range, Everything was in range at the age of 26. After all my research online, I realized that 250 milligrams of testosterone enanthate would put me around 1,500, 2,000, 2,500 nanograms per deciliter are my total testosterone. And I figured, that could be potentially 2 to 4 times as much or 5 times as much as I'm currently have. That should be enough as a first cycle. Now, luckily, I was able to source pharmaceutical grade. So I went sweet Iranian Aburean testosterone enanthate. I didn't have any post-injection pain. Really, I didn't have any post-injection pain. I was surprised because I would read a lot about post-injection pain and people would get crippling, pain for days on end. And even though I experienced a bit of discomfort by injecting half a cc of Aburean testosterone enanthate twice a week on Wednesday evening and Sunday morning, right? Spaced perfectly 3.5 days apart, or was it 4 days apart? So you're right in the middle for the most stable serum concentrations. But looking back on the protocol now, I probably should have done daily microinjections of 0.14, 0.15 milliliters or 36 milligrams testosterone enanthate per day instead. But back then, 10, 11 years ago, nobody talked about daily microinjections to control your serum estradiol concentrations or the relation between body fat and the potential for aromatization. Now, when I did my first cycle, I was, I think, 15% body fat. Unfortunately, I don't have any pictures because I didn't have my own camera. And I would only borrow a camera from a friend or my dad when I was in shape. So I have pictures when I was in decent shape, like those pictures I showed previously. So my body fat was, let's say, 15% at that time. And knowing what I know right now, I would switch to daily microinjections to keep serum concentrations as stable as possible. Not do a bi-weekly approach on Wednesday evening and Sunday morning, because I still got some estrogenic side effects around week 4, and then I added in the Arimidex. So my initial plan was to run testosterone enanthate for 13 weeks, then do post-cycle therapy, the cookie cutter post-cycle therapy, ACG, Nolvadex, and Clomid, which still works. I did something comparable recently, and my testosterone bounced back to, 640 nanograms per deciliter. Or what was it? 630 nanograms per deciliter. So that PCT still holds up. You just have to have your hormone levels to climb from the time you did your last injection to the time you start your post-cycle therapy, which we didn't know back then. I would do testosterone propionate at the end of the cycle and then start ACG the next day because testosterone propionate clears in a week, right? And you can already kickstart testicular function with ACG. So if I knew back then what I know now, I would stick with daily microinjections to keep serum concentrations as stable as possible instead of doing this bi-weekly approach. I still do it with some of my clients because, again, we have their baseline estrogen readings and I can control all of the variables a little bit more in depth because now I have the experience that I didn't have for my first cycle. So I did that for 4 weeks, 250 milligrams testosterone enanthate per week. And then I added in the ACG because at that time there was still information that ACG was able to sustain testicular function. I don't have any information on why I didn't add in the ACG from the beginning. Maybe at that time there were protocols that the first 4 weeks you don't have to add in the ACG, but I wrote down distinctly in the cycle log that I was experiencing testicular atrophy at week 4. So I think I had a decent hookup with pharmaceutical grade. So, right, I called the guy up and I said, hey, testicular atrophy, I'm going to need to add some ACG to keep testicular function going. And I sent on a protocol of, well, the protocol was clearly all over the place. The first week I did 500 IUs ACG on the injection day. And then, so that's 2 injections of 500 IUs ACG. The first week I started ACG at week 5. And then the next week I dropped that down to 250 IUs ACG on the injection day of the testosterone. And then later on, I dropped it to 175 IUs every other day. Way too many adjustments, obviously. What I should have done is 250 IUs 3 times per week and spaced those away from the injections. Now, if I were to go with daily administrations, it doesn't really matter. So in this case, I did 125 milligrams of testosterone enanthate on Wednesday and Sunday, and I should have used 250 IUs ACG in between those injections. So let's say 250 IUs Monday, Thursday, and Saturday, for example, right? Or maybe on Monday and Friday instead, if I was able to keep testicular function going with 250 IUs ACG twice per week. Now, as my cycle log indicates, around the time I started adding ACG at 500 IUs twice a week in week 5, started getting minor back knee, minor puffy nipples, and a little bit more water retention. So, contacted the source probably. I said, I need some Arimidex because I have high estrogen symptoms. So I added 0.25 milligrams of Arimidex every other day from week 7 onwards. And by week 8, I noticed that the puffy nipples were subsided, the water retention was subsided, and the back knee was improving. Again, I was eating 100% clean, besides a cheat meal that I would have on Saturday, because after week 5, I was already up from 88 kilos to about 92, 93 kilos. So that's 5 kilo gain on 5,100, 5,200 calories. Again, I started my first cycle at the end of the off season. I noticed I was not making any more improvements. Also stress from lawsuits, obviously. So I added in the 250 milligrams testosterone enanthate per week. And I, quote unquote, blew up from 88 kilos to 82, 83 kilos. And at that point, when I realized I was 92 kilos and the Arimidex was starting to work to help strip a little bit of water off, and I was just getting stronger and stronger and stronger without really increasing my calories, I just decided to start cutting with the basic cutting diet that I was always following, a ketogenic diet consisting of eggs, beef, chicken, and salmon, right? 5 meals, 1 shake, consisting of those protein sources, and using whole eggs or avocado or olive oil or mixed nuts to get my fat in. So that went pretty well. I believe in my cycle log it says that I was still getting stronger and stronger and stronger up until week. It looks like I just kept getting stronger. So that's pretty cool to see, because I remember I did end up at 2,400 calories at the end, which was way higher than the amount of calories I would eat when I was still drug-free. I might have ended up at 1,800 calories, sometimes even 1,500 calories towards the end. Then again, I would do crash diets because I didn't have so much time, because I had to focus on work. And, when you have a summer holiday that only lasts for 8 weeks, or when you're going to university, right? You only have 8 weeks, 6 weeks of summer holiday where you can actually diet. You don't want to diet while you're doing exams. I would basically do a crash diet with protein and vegetables and maybe a little bit of fat or a little bit of carbs around the workout. But on this diet, I took it a little bit more seriously because besides the lawsuits, I didn't have to go to work. And I spent a little money that I still had available on this cycle and the food and the trading and everything that's related. So I ended up, let's say the majority of the cycle is 250 milligrams testosterone enanthate, 175 IUs ACG every other day, and 0.25 milligrams of Arimidex every other day. If I were to do this cycle again now, I would do daily administrations of testosterone enanthate, totaling up to 250 milligrams per week. So that's 36, 37 milligrams per day. And I would do 250 IUs ACG 3 times per week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And then if I needed an aromatase inhibitor during that time or something to control estradiol concentrations, I would look into diindolylmethane instead, 200 milligrams diindolylmethane per day to help balance the estrogens between estrone, estradiol, and estriol. And I think 200 milligrams diindolylmethane per day would have been sufficient on this protocol of 250 milligrams testosterone enanthate per week and 250 IUs ACG 3 times per week. Now, when I noticed I was getting leaner and leaner and leaner, I wanted to do a photo shoot, right? Immortalize my first cycle in a series of pictures and videos. So I borrowed a video camera from a friend, and I do have footage of what I looked like somewhere towards the end of the cycle. So I did this 250 test, let's say 175 IUs ACG every other day and 0.25 milligrams Arimidex all the way till the end. And then at week 14, I switched to 50 milligrams of testosterone propionate and 50 milligrams of desmazambon Winstrol suspension. And at the time, I didn't know you shouldn't mix oil-based injections with water-based injections for the risk of developing infections. Now, luckily, I didn't develop an infection because the testosterone propionate that I used was pharmaceutical grade, came from Thailand, Testolic. I would not use that anymore because they use ethyl oleate, and it's not really one of my carrier oils of choice. And the desmazambons, luckily those were legit. Were very painful to inject, but actually mixing the Testolic testosterone propionate with the Winstrol, I had post-injection pain, but it was not that bad compared to some of the underground Winstrol that I ran afterwards. That gave me horrible inflammation. But keep in mind that the desmazambons were 50 milligrams per 1 milliliter of Winstrol suspension, and the testosterone propionate was also 50 milligrams per 1 ml, because those Testolics come in a concentration of 100 milligrams per 2 milliliter. So I would rotate injection sites. I would go to spotinjections.com, which is still up nowadays, to figure out where I could inject, right? In the quads, in the glutes, in the lats, in the chest, in the traps, in the shoulders. I rotated my injection sites on my first cycle quite a bit, just to get some experience. And the only injection sites I would recommend nowadays are glutes, lats, and upper quads, not in the middle of the quad, like they say at spot injections, because if you do ass to grass squats, that gets so tight and so painful that I would rather inject a little bit closer to the hip or the ventral glute or the upper glute, right? Just in a place where you don't feel this intense pressure internally right after your injection when you're doing strenuous workouts. So I would rotate my injection sites, and I distinctly remember injecting 50 milligrams of testosterone propionate mixed with 50 milligrams of Desma Winstrol suspension. So that's a 2 milliliter injection in my chest. And in my cycle log, I kept a note because I thought I injected glass. That's how painful it was. So as I'm reading through my cycle log, I just remembered that I was doing 2 injections bilaterally because I wanted to keep everything symmetrical, because I did notice a little bit of inflammation. So I did 25 milligrams testosterone propionate, half a cc, plus half a cc of 25 milligrams Winstrol suspension on both sides. So if I would do glutes, I would inject 1 cc Testpro plus Winstrol on one side and 1 cc Testpro and Winstrol on the other side, just to keep everything symmetrical and see if there was any difference between both injection sites. So I'll give you guys a couple quotes from my cycle log after I switched from 2 injections per week to 2 injections per day. Started injecting daily. Winstrol irritation is noticeable the day after the injection. Glutes are very easy, but I can feel the oil in the left cheek. The right cheek has no noticeable irritation, but the next day, both glutes are sore. And a couple swear words, which we're not going to repeat here. Then a couple days later, I said, injecting twice a day is quite a handful. Injection sites are very sore, especially the chest. It feels like I injected glass. Lats are very easy to do. I'm starting to get very lean and veiny everywhere. Pumps aren't as great anymore. having some difficulties spreading the lats out, probably because I was doing lat injections also. And then a couple days later, I wrote down the triceps are also very irritated after the injections. I'm taking a hot bath daily to help with the post-injection pain. After a thorough massage on the chest, it feels a lot better. It feels that the oil and water have dissipated from the area. Funny enough, I wrote all of this in English, even though it's not my first language. Maybe I had the foresight to one day post all this stuff on YouTube publicly. Probably not. I don't think I had the foresight for that, but yeah, I always found English to be a little bit easier language compared to Dutch. Somehow. Well, a lot of stuff about, getting leaner and still feeling strong and getting stronger somehow and understanding why everybody's on steroids around me. So now what I would have changed to this protocol is actually quite simple. I would just keep the testosterone Enanthate in and do daily micro-injections, but increase my Arimidex or Aromacin. Again, I would prefer to run Aromacin nowadays over Arimidex. But if I was running diindolmethane at the time and keeping my estrogen favorable, fortunately I would not be able to confirm that with blood work because in Holland you only get one blood work per year. And there's, you can't ask your primary healthcare physician at the time to do additional blood work. They would just raise their eyebrows and say, why do you want to check your estrogen again? So you didn't even bother. You would do your annual blood work and that would be it. And of course, you don't want to raise any suspicions by doing blood work again and then showing that your lipids and testosterone and estradiol are kind of messed up. That would be, that would probably go on your record. So we didn't do blood work on cycle. I wish it was more available, right? There's a website nowadays in Holland called bloedwaardentest.nl where you can do blood work out of your own pocket. But back then we didn't have that website, but I would definitely go there on a couple months basis just to confirm if everything was still going according to plan. Let's say I would do 250 milligrams testosterone Enanthate per week, 250 IUs ACG to sustain testicular function 3 times per week, and run diindolmethane to keep estrogen balance favorable. And let's say that was sufficient. Then the last 2 weeks, I would either add in probably Aromacin was not available at the time. I would prefer to take Aromacin, 25 milligrams Aromacin per day, just to crush the estrogen the last 2 weeks and continue with testosterone Enanthate. Yes, you would obviously feel horrible, but you'd lose some subcutaneous water retention that is induced by the estradiol, and then look good after a peaking protocol for a photoshoot. Maybe at the time I would have chosen to go with 2.5 milligrams Arimidex instead. That was available, I believe. But, from my experience, like a lot of guys, they don't have access to letrozole. So I would just do 2.5 milligrams Arimidex, and it appears to get the estrogen down quite as well as 2.5 milligrams letrozole. I think on a milligram for milligram basis, letrozole and Arimidex are very comparable. But I would have to crush my estrogen with a traditional medicinal aromatase inhibitor besides the diindolmethane or the Arimidex that I was using at that time. And then do it a little bit more aggressively. And of course, if I were to do daily microinjections of the testosterone Enanthate, I would probably have the same serum estradiol concentrations as dosing testosterone propionate on a daily basis. So I would run the testosterone Enanthate all the way through to the end, increase aromatase inhibitors or add an aromatase inhibitor in at a dose sufficient enough to crush serum estradiol concentrations, and then run probably Winstrol tablets plus Superdrol tablets on top. But Superdrol was not available at the time. There was a discontinued product in the development of Masterone and Anadrol. At the time, Superdrol was also developed, but nobody saw any practical medical applications for it. So that compound was abandoned. And now, of course, during the time of pro-hormones, Superdrol reemerged, just like Arimistane, for example. And those are the only two pro-hormones of that time, which are just steroids. And they're not pro-hormones, they're just good old steroids. Only those two are actually, has some practical applications. I think Aromacin is the only pro-hormone that ever got FDA approved. So I would, knowing everything I know now, assuming that Superdrol was available back then, I would just run testosterone Enanthate and 30 milligrams Superdrol on top. And it would probably look better than I did at the end, right? Because Superdrol adds a lot of fullness. And I was not in contest shape in any way, shape, or form. I think I achieved better conditioning when I was drug-free. And given the fact that Superdrol was not available at the time, I would probably just run, let's say, 30 milligrams of Winstrol and 30 milligrams Anavar per day, and then finish off the cycle in that fashion. Just 2 weeks, that's usually enough to get the cosmetic changes that you look dramatically different on a photo shoot. Of course, I could have run that for a lot longer, but I got great results, man, on 250 milligrams testosterone enanthate per week, and I was getting stronger and stronger and stronger as my calories were coming down. Towards the end, I noticed that I was losing a little bit of pump, a little bit of fullness, but of course, calories are low and you're doing a ketogenic diet. So what do you expect towards the end? And at week 10, I also added in the Clenbuterol because I wanted to speed up the fat loss a little bit. And again, the floodgates of performance-enhancing drugs were opened. I asked an entire product list of my source. I just went through everything that I could potentially add to this first cycle that could potentially be my last cycle as well. Again, considering that I was going to travel for such a long time. So at week 10, I added in the Clenbuterol. Week 1, I started 250 milligrams a test. Week 5, I added in the ACG. Week 7, I added in the Arimidex. And week 10, I added in the Clenbuterol. So I ran that I ran that all the way through my post-cycle therapy. Just to stay lean, right? Week 10 started with 40 micrograms Clenbuterol. Then the day after, 60 micrograms. I did 60 micrograms Clen for 2 days. Then 80 micrograms Clen for 2 days. Then 100 micrograms Clen for 2 weeks, it seems. And then I bumped it up to 120 micrograms for a week. And then I added in the Ketotifen because the information was there that Ketotifen helps to upregulate the beta-2 adrenergic receptors and make Clenbuterol a lot more potent again, because I did notice that it was not as efficient as running it in the beginning. Again, I was going by side effects, not by the fat loss. I noticed that the jittery was gone, the jittery effect, the shaky hands, that was already gone. I wasn't getting any micro cramps anymore because I added in 5,000 milligrams of taurine. And I increased my sodium intake along the way. And I was focusing a little bit more on my potassium intake. Yes, at that time I tracked all my micronutrients already. So that's 11 years ago. I have the entire diet as well, unfortunately in Dutch. But it tracks, I think, a large portion of the micronutrients. Not all of them, but at least the electrolytes and, the omega-3s and all that stuff. The cholesterol and this and that. I kept track of most of it already. So I was able to resolve most of the side effects from the Clenbuterol with taurine and electrolyte adjustments. And knowing what I know right now, I would probably half the dose because I wrote that in my cycle log. After adding the Ketotifen in, what I tell all my clients, after you add in 1 milligrams Ketotifen before bed to make Clenbuterol more effective by upregulating the beta-2 adrenergic receptors again, I would halve the dose of Clen from 120 micrograms to 60 micrograms. And I did not do that. I ran 120 micrograms Clen for 3 more days. And I noted in my cycle log that my heart palpitations were tremendous. So after 3 days of that, I reduced to 80 micrograms of Clenbuterol. Close enough. I would still do 60 micrograms and then slowly build it up as the side effects would dissipate. Again, there's no fat burner out there like Clenbuterol. DNP is obviously more effective, but after my 4-day stint with DNP, I don't ever want to run that again. So 120 micrograms of Clenbuterol with a little dip to 80 micrograms of Clen, and then towards the end, I bumped it up to 120 micrograms of Clenbuterol again. Then I took off Clen to prepare for a peak week. Peak week, that's the term we used back then. And then I reintroduced the Clenbuterol for my cookie cutter ACG post-cycle therapy. And again, I started that from one day to the next. I did my last injection of testosterone propionate and Winstrol suspension. Did my photo shoot a couple days later. And then I started ACG at 500 IUs every other day for 2 weeks. And then I did 40 milligrams of Novadex and 100 milligrams of Clomid, tapered down over the period of 4 weeks. And in my cycle log, there's nothing about losing strength, nothing about feeling lethargic or tired, getting a little bit sloppy and watery because I was eating, right? It was after a photo shoot. So Yeah, I was probably eating sufficiently, again, because it was a crash diet towards the end. And besides dropping the Clenbuterol to half the dose after introducing the Ketotifen before bed, I would probably not change much to this Clenbuterol protocol because I added in the Clenbuterol when I felt that fat loss was stagnating, which is the same practice I would still hold up today with myself or my clients, even though I'm not really a fan of Clenbuterol anymore because of the heart palpitations and the profuse sweating that it induces while you're training in a gym without air conditioning. But I would still do a comparable practice, add Clenbuterol in at a point where fat loss starts to stall, slowly build up the dosage as needed, although I don't do it as fast as I did in this first cycle protocol, and then add in the Ketotifen somewhere at a point where fat loss is no longer really progressing with the use of Clenbuterol. And of course, caloric adjustments would take place, and cardio adjustments would take place. I was doing 2 hours of cardio, by the way, during this diet. That would be my old school way to do it. Start with 30 minutes a day and then increase 5 minutes every week, right? So I would do 35 minutes the week after, and then within 6 weeks, I would be at 1 hour in the morning and 1 hour in the evening with training somewhere in the afternoon. Again, no obligation, so I was able to finally do this full-time bodybuilder thing. Which after this, I didn't check my hormone levels, again, because of the healthcare system in Holland doesn't really allow it. But I really had no downtime. My sex drive was still good. I felt good. My energy was good. Again, I was eating a ton of food because the diet was over. And to this day, I still have a hard time controlling that post-diet rebound. And back then, I probably ate like an asshole, everything inside. So I ended up at the end of the post-psychotherapy, I ended up at 88 kilos again. Yeah, I think during the diet at the last part it was 76, 78 kgs. Let me show you guys what I looked like about a week before I did a peaking protocol for a photo shoot. So you guys can have an understanding what I looked like before at my decent shape without the performance enhancing drugs. And then I looked like this after a couple weeks on a PED protocol. So I'll show you guys what I looked like towards the last week before the photo shoot first. So this is a little bit of a gym posing where you can see that I still hold a decent amount of water retention. So it's probably because I was not controlling my estrogen well and maybe a little bit of inflammation from the training and the high sodium diet that I was following while using Clenbuterol, and on a ketogenic diet, your sodium intake is usually a little bit higher as well. And again, running ethyl oleate, how much systemic inflammation is there? I'm not really sure. That's something I didn't know about back then either. A little bit of lower back fat. I would say I'm 10% body fat. Maybe even that is generous. I have been leaner when I was drug-free. But again, a lot of new territory. And I still wanted to make good progress strength-wise on this first cycle. But I did end up looking pretty decent with water manipulation. Now I feel that the majority of what improved were actually my quads. Those grew quite a lot on my first cycle. Obviously, my upper body grew as well, but I was very happy with the amount of size that I was able to gain on my lower body. And I did feel finally like I looked like something. Could I have looked better? Absolutely, right? But again, with the knowledge I had back then, and the ash hole that I usually turned into while I was dieting, again, I had severe anger management issues whenever I would do a diet. So I felt that I was pretty close to calling it quits anyway, even though I could have been a lot leaner, obviously. So this is after all the water manipulation, the water loading, the carb loading, and all that kind of stuff. You see that everything tightened up quite a bit, and we have a very nice lighting somewhere in the middle of the day. This also was the hottest day of the year. I think it was 35 degrees in Holland. Not the best time to do a peak week with water manipulation and dehydration, and I believe I had half a glass of wine, because, yeah, that's what you did back then, for vasodilation. So I had half a glass of wine and no water up until that point, midday. I think we recorded this at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, because that is the most favorable lighting. So I remember just sweating my ass off the entire way through, even though I manipulated water a little bit. There was still plenty of water left for me to sweat. So we used olive oil, I believe. Man, it's so many memories. Used olive oil as a shine. And of course, I went tanning like 2 times a week just to get a little bit of a base coat, because I was white as a ghost before I did my first cycle. So all in all, I was very happy with the results. I felt that I ended up looking good. Could have been a little bit leaner, but again, at one point I usually call it quits on these diets because I know that I turn into a gigantic a-hole, and then it's not very enjoyable for myself or the people around me. So nowadays I diet a little bit slower and recruit to the pharmacology a little bit more extensively. Maybe not in the future, but in the diets that I did after this diet, I would optimize every vector just to make sure I stay in a decent caloric intake. And again, if I push it down at the end, I would optimize every factor for fat loss just to keep my mood intact and keep my productivity high. Because I always noticed that my productivity would go down to the gutter basically towards the end of the diet. And part of that is just poor dieting strategies, dropping your calories too low, restricting particular nutrients, even though I was tracking my micronutrient intake. Again, this bodybuilding stuff is a extensive learning journey. And as I go along and continue with it, and especially after I started helping people with their bodybuilding aspirations, I learned a lot. I learned a lot along the way. So still ended up looking pretty decent on the day of the photo shoot. Obviously could have looked a lot better, but then again, it's bodybuilding, so there's always room for improvement. I think the majority of the stuff I would still do the same way, but I would just make a couple adjustments to the protocol, being doing daily microinjections with the testosterone enanthate, ending up at 250 milligrams per week. I would use dinyl 200 milligrams per day as my sole method to control estradiol concentrations, and then switch to 25 milligrams aromacin or 2.5 milligrams Arimidex or letrozole at the end to crush serum estradiol concentrations for a photo shoot. I would probably run this cycle a little bit longer to allow myself to get a little bit leaner while maintaining strength or increasing strength towards the end. Even though I was getting flatter, I was able to sustain strength for the majority of the time until I did the cookie cutter depletion workout at the end. And so I'd probably run this cycle for probably 20 weeks, considering the dose is so low. Control my estrogen with dinyl, use 250 IUs ACG 3 times per week to keep testicular function going. I believe I ran that all the way through. 250 IUs ACG and then doubled it to 500 IUs ACG every other day. I recovered just fine. I would not do that again, though. I would discontinue the ACG about a month before starting the post-cycle therapy. And then, I would do the ACG on the same day as my last testosterone injection. Let hormone levels decline to you feel like a little girl with clinically androgen-deficient testosterone concentrations, and then start the ACG. So there's no negative feedback because testosterone is low, estrogen is low, and the progesterone, DHA, and pregnenolone are probably also low. And then there's no negative feedback on the HPTA. And then start ACG, and then do the Nolvadex, Clomid, and then perhaps look at other vectors like Kisspeptin 10 or triptorelin, gonadorelin, boosterelin, etc. Or exchange the Clomid for the enclomiphene, right? Or the tamoxifen for the raloxifene. There's so many areas you can explore for post-cycle therapy. But again, my post-cycle therapy was successful at the time, probably because I was young and not on cycle for that long. My cycle lasted for 15 weeks. If I were to do it again, I would make it last for 20 weeks, just so I could get leaner, run testosterone enanthate all the way through, run the ACG all the way through from start to finish. And at the end, I would go on a little bit more extensive protocol, running 30 milligrams of oral Winstrol per day, 30 milligrams of oral Superdrol per day, or Anavar per day, considering that Superdrol was not available at that time. And then, again, crush the estrogen with aromacin, Arimidex, or letrozole. And just continue with the ACG all the way through, because even though you produce a little bit of estradiol, I don't think it would have made a difference in a photo shoot like this. You can crush your estradiol pretty well to single digits, even when you're running ACG, even though you produce a decent amount of estradiol directly in the testicles while you're running ACG, because the testicles also have aromatase enzymes, and medical aromatase inhibitors are not able to enter the testicles and inhibit the aromatase enzymes there. So you would just inhibit the conversion of testosterone into estradiol in all the other tissues besides the testicles. while running ACG. And if you're not running ACG, that's a non-issue because you're not producing any testosterone or estrogen in your testicles anymore. Maybe discontinue the ACG the last 2 weeks. Let's see how. It probably wouldn't have made a difference with the water manipulation. Probably wouldn't have made a difference, considering I would be running a pretty hefty dose of an aromatase inhibitor. And then I think I would have looked a bit drier, a bit leaner, certainly a lot harder thanks to the Superdrol. And I would recover just the same because I would be running ACG on cycle for the majority of the duration as well. I would still like to do an ACG protocol to see what my testosterone potential would have been before I started my first cycle. Again, that's something I designed recently after I helped a lot of people with their first cycle. I would tell them, okay, let's try every vector regarding supplementation first. Again, at the time we didn't have ashwagandha root extract. I did run vitamin D3. I was in a high stress environment when I tested my testosterone levels. I was not running magnesium. I was not running carnitine. I was not doing a lot of things that could optimize your testosterone production, like icing the testicles, for example. So I'm sure I could have made more out of my natural drug-free bodybuilding back then if I had the information I do nowadays with the icing the testicles and doing all the health supplementation known to man that are can potentially increase testosterone production. And also run an ACG protocol to see where my testosterone levels could potentially be at. See how much testosterone my testicles could produce by taking exogenous ACG. So there's a lot of adjustments I would have made, but I think the overall takeaway of the cycle, I would still do the same. I would still do the testosterone dose, just the injection frequency I would switch. I would still take ACG. I would still take Arimidex, albeit in a different form towards the end. And I would use dinomethane to control my estradiol. I would not do injectable Winstrol. I think that's only for competitions. I honestly don't think it made a difference in my physique over oral Winstrol. But I would combine oral Winstrol with oral Superdrol or oral Anavar to look probably harder than I did towards the end during my photoshoot. And then use a mild diuretic instead of doing this complicated water manipulation with water loading and sodium loading, and then drinking a ton of coffee and wine and all that stuff, all this stuff that, you can make a lot less complicated by taking half a diazide or half a hydrochlorothiazide the night before a photo shoot or a contest, right? So I've learned a lot along the way. Still, I would say this first cycle was pretty successful. I'm happy with how I looked. And I hope you can learn something from this. All right. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this new studio. Let me know in the comment section how the audio is, what you think about the backdrop, if the lighting on my face looks cool or not. Let me all know in the comment section. Much appreciated. Much love. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you're looking for the most comprehensive guides to bodybuilding pharmacology, you can find the ebooks at my website, vigoroussteve.com/shop. Looking for personalized advice? I'm always available for consultations. You can find the rates in the consultations section. Contact me through the contact form on the website or through Instagram directly. Follow me on Instagram at VigorousSteve. Front double bicep for you guys. Vigorous crew, you guys know what to do. Thanks so much for watching. And I'll see you guys in the next video.